Welcome to Flagstaff County Podcast. I am Nick Dunn, the Assistant Agricultural Fieldman, and joining us is Megan Andre, who is the Executive Director for Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society, and will be speaking on Shelterbelt renovation and restoration.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
Also joining us is Harry Brook, our Agricultural Fieldman. So with that, Megan, the floor is yours.
Hi, I'm glad to join you tonight to share some information about renovation and maintenance of shelter belts. I can start out tonight by mentioning we're conducting this presentation and we'd like to respectfully acknowledge we live, work, and plant trees on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory, traditional land of the Indigenous people of Canada and home of the Métis. So I'm Megan Andre, and I work with the Agroforestry Woodlot Extension Society. Lots of words, but we call ourselves Oz. So we're a nonprofit organization, and we encourage sustainable forest management through conservation and restoration. So our mission, simply put, is we teach people about the value of trees. So we empower stewards at the community level, and we work to build capacity for successful restoration projects using trees through educating people and connecting them with resources and enabling others to successfully deliver these projects. So myself, I've got about 20 years experience in the agriculture and forestry industry. My hometown is Killam, Alberta, so I'm right from Flagstaff County, very familiar with shelter belts and Shelterbelt Restoration in the Flagstaff region. Let's see, Oz, we're a community-based organization, so we're really excited to be invited to talk to Flagstaff County. I'm really excited to be brought in on community-based projects, community-based economic supports, and really we're excited about growing capacity and community resiliency. So tonight specifically, we're going to be talking about restoration and maintenance of shelter belts. So we'll cover a brief overview of shelter belts. We'll talk about planning for succession, and then we'll talk about some of that restoration and maintenance activities and maybe even some inspiration for what you could restore and maintain to achieve. So right off the bat, the first question that we always get asked, what is agroforestry? If you're thinking about conventional agroforestry, well, that's easy. You look out your truck window as you're driving down the range road. Conventional agriculture, that looks like that beautiful golden field of wheat. You know, no weeds, no trees, just wheat as far as the horizon you can see. Agroforestry looks a bit differently. So agroforestry can be described as the intentional incorporation of trees into agricultural operations. So this practice, it was once very commonly used in our areas, in all areas of the world. It had fallen out of favor as landowners began to manage larger and larger parcels of land. However, more recently, agroforestry is becoming more and more common as people are moving towards regenerative agriculture. So when they're seeing signs of erosion, signs of kind of increased environmental hazards coming up, they're looking for different ways to add resiliency and increase their output to their agricultural land. And so that's where Oz comes in. You know, so we really share with people how trees are the solution. So a brief overview, I think, would be a great place to start. We'll kind of start out by running through what is a shelter belt, and we'll discuss a bit more its next generation shelter belts or eco buffers. So going back, what is a shelter belt? So those are those linear tree and shrub plantings. They're acting as a barrier to environmental conditions. So some people know them as windbreaks, as they were intentionally designed and planted to reduce wind speeds across prairie landscapes. So we've got tens of thousands of kilometers of shelter belts planted across the prairies. Seedlings were distributed through the PFRA for many years. I know our family farm, we planted seedlings through the PFRA years ago. So these reductions in wind speeds was a driver of shelter belts that dates back to kind of that Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. And really these features, they weren't established for longevity, but rather that really quickly growing height of those non-native species to provide that windbreak function. Picture your conventional shelter belt. So you typically got those 3 rows of shelter belt. You've got your Caragana row, your Oak-Leaf poplar, and your white spruce. So that traditional shelter belt has evolved over the years, and we'll next talk about the concept of an eco-buffer. So an eco-buffer comes from about a century of research and experience with shelter belts, and it again builds on those same features, that physical buffer of trees across our landscape. But the eco-buffer adds different points, different strengths, as it incorporates dense planting of native species. So you're going to see that shelter from the wind initially. You're going to see lots of different native species working together to quickly establish a self-sustaining, high-quality habitat buffer across your landscape. So in the long term, you're going to need very minimal maintenance with this type of planting. And you're going to see additional ecosystem services for your native wildlife. You're going to see additional native services such as pollinators, and of course, all of those different benefits and resiliency that native trees and shrubs bring. So what exactly is the benefit of an eco-buffer to you as a landowner? So when you're thinking about an eco-buffer, you're thinking of these native diverse trees and shrubs planted in a row. Of course, you can plant them in, depending on the size of space you have available, you can plant them in a row or even just a little patch or an eco-buffer island and still bring you some of the same services. So the basic principles can be applied to any area. You plant at a high density. You take advantage of areas on your property where you can kind of make the biggest impact for the smaller landscape. So you want to look to creating a buffer around ecologically sensitive areas, for example. And your goal is to capture the entire site. So where you think back to that traditional shelter belt, where you have nice space between each of the different rows of trees, you'll need to look to some maintenance for that traditional shelter belt. Whereas an eco-buffer, you're relying on that resilient propagation of these native species to capture the entire site, quickly eliminating any need for maintenance. As well, thinking about the long term, and we'll talk about this quite a bit more in this presentation, but you'll be looking to this native species composition to self-sustain itself. So in effect, it will be sustaining itself over the years rather than requiring significant amounts of maintenance over its lifespan. All right, so lots of different native trees and shrubs have lots of different ecological roles. So when you break down our shelter belt our shelter belt structure, we break down our eco-buffer structure, you'll see that each of the different types of species have different services they provide. So the short shrubs, they provide that understory diversity. The taller shrubs, intermediate canopy layer, they provide a whole different range of ecosystem services for a whole different range of wildlife. Of course, your pioneer trees species, those are the fastest growing, taller tree and shrub species, and they really provide that base habitat, the protection for your longer lived species, which will eventually fill in and dominate that area. So we talk about planting in a dense configuration in an eco-buffer, and that really relies on companion planting. So you're looking to all the different native trees and shrubs to really complement each other, providing services to one another to support overall better growth of your species. So thinking about different ways trees and shrubs can work together. Like I said, we've got the pioneer species providing shelter for the long-lived species. We've got some of our short shrubs capturing any disturbed ground to prevent invasive weeds from creeping in. And we've got our tall shrubs potentially fixing nitrogen. So overall, everyone works together to create a better environment. All right. Let's see.
Question.
Oh, go ahead, Harry. I see your question in the chat.
Well, there was a couple of questions I had. One was on the plants, the species. So what you're talking about is looking at mostly native species, or could you use a mix of native species and also introduced species?
Yes. So the foundation of an eco buffer, essentially, you're going to look to your native species. And if you're looking for examples of what would grow well in your area, look to like a native forest nearby, and you can select your species from there. And then for every planting, you want to really think about or plan or forecast the ecosystem services that you're looking for from your planting project. So you can always supplement your eco buffer with different non-native species to add those services that you're looking for. Of course, your native species are going to be the most resilient choice. So they're going to be those species that do well in any severe weather events.
So basically, look for something that's already natively adapted to the area.
That's right.
To thrive, and that's been a real problem I've seen in some of the shelter belts that have been used in the past, that they're not really well suited for the environment. Like there's an awful lot of white spruce used, but sometimes our prairie winters are a little harsh on them.
Yeah, that's true. Really, one of the biggest things that we tell folks through planning the species composition for your shelter belt or your eco buffer is to look to your area and see what species are thriving. So that can be applied to both native species as well as non-native species. So if your neighbor has a really successful, pick a tree, for example.
Green ash?
Green ash, sure. Potentially, you've got the same soil conditions, you've got the same landscape conditions, and a green ash would do really well in your area as well. So think about the topography, the different environmental conditions of your site. Are they similar to that site where that healthy green ash is? Potentially that would be a good species for you to choose as well.
So what would be considered an ideal number of different species? And also, is there any particular formation that you'd plant them in, or would it just sort of be in clumps? I'm wondering, because we still see almost the vast majority of the tree orders we get tend to be in the lines, one line poplar, one line shrub, one line, say lilac, maybe, and then white spruce. That's the old-fashioned way of doing it.
Yep. Planting an eco buffer looks a little bit different, but what we want to do is you want to mimic that natural structure of a forest. So you want to set up that planting for success, and you look at a natural forested area. An eco buffer island is kind of one that we talk about because you can make it longer or shorter, but essentially the structure is the same. So you look to plant several rows of trees and shrubs. So all those different types of species here, each has their own ecological role. And then you want to plant them in a configuration that is going to set itself up for good succession. So as the ground fills in, as each of these species sucker and propagate, you're going to see those taller trees forming the interior of the planting project, with the shorter shrubs on the exterior and the taller shrubs in between. And eventually, as time goes by, you're going to see your longer lived trees forming that, dominating that interior of your planting. And you'll see your shrubs and your exterior species kind of creeping outward. So they'll be aiming to capture more and more area if it's available to them. Of course, if they're on the edge of an agricultural planting, they'll kind of be held back by that.
Until they hit with spray drift.
Well, and depending on the species you pick, you can plan to have a little more resiliency to spray drift too.
So Megan, I got a quick question for you. So you mentioned you would like the density to be like a forest structure, right? So you mentioned 3-row, would more rows the better? Would a 5-row be better than a 3-row if there's the space provided for that?
Absolutely. We always want to take into account the amount of space you have, for example. Taking advantage, of course, of marginal land first, because that's always an area where we're not kind of taking land out of cultivation, for example, or agricultural use. So making use of those marginal lands and then making the most of what you've got. So if you have enough room for a 5-row eco buffer, the more services you'll be able to see that provide.
Okay, and that
So
kind of goes with the succession planning as well, right?
Yep, absolutely. So you can kind of plan your 5-row eco buffer to have the same composition with a little bit extra area of that middle eco buffer row for your, pioneer and longer lived species.
Okay.
Could you maybe get a little further into when you talk about ecological services? Could you specify what those are?
Oh, ecological services, of course. So those always likes to refer to those as your tree services. So when you're planning a planting project, you can think to all of the different services that trees provide. So as growing up on a farm, I can put all of the tree services that I liked and that our eco buffer Shelterbelts provided. The first one that comes to mind that I still value would be harvesting Saskatoons with my family. So that was one of the tree services that was provided, both for people as well as for all of the birds that came to enjoy them. You can look at those ecosystem services as, for example, services provided to agricultural operations, so through pollinators as one, or nitrogen fixation through erosion control or
Moisture management, right?
Yeah, management. You can look to different wildlife habitat or threatened or endangered species habitat. You can look to the trees for their physical structure to block dust or noise or wind across the landscape. There's lots of different ecological services that trees provide. You really have to pick which ones you're planting for, and you can really tailor your planting for any one or more of those different roles.
They are services, but as they say in the old school, there's no such thing as a free lunch. When do you think we're ever going to get to the point where there might be some recognition by the powers that be of the ecological services and the value that provides? Because that seems to be the biggest sticking point in retaining any of these native bush patches, is the fact that there is no financial benefit to those people that are farming it. And oftentimes it's seen mostly as an impediment to field efficiency.
I think we're coming back, like initially regenerative agriculture, or that agriculture that looked at the whole ecosystem as a whole, was more commonly practiced. We've moved away from it a bit with our larger scale equipment, clearing ephemeral drains, for example, or shelter belts to make room for that equipment to move through. But I think we're really seeing a shift, or at least Oz is seeing a shift in agricultural communities moving back to regenerative models. So there's lots of different programs out there now. They're gaining in momentum, seeing the value of those ecological services and how they're really impacting and increasing production in agricultural land. So through increases to native pollinators, through increases to resiliency, erosion control is a big one. I think we're going to see this spring the real value of having those trees and shrubs around your ephemeral drains kind of to slow down and encourage that water to move through groundwater rather than overland flow. So the services are there. We just have to look for them. And I think that's really going to gain in momentum over the next few years.
I hope you're right.
Yeah,
Me too.
I got something to add to that too. I do believe there is an economical benefit there. When I compare it to, cultivated acres, I'm not sure if it's I'm not sure if it depends on markets, right? If it pencils out there, but as well to add to erosion, I believe it's also it's a good barrier as well when they're strategically placed, right? So talking about bringing wildlife in, but it also might keep some pests and disease out, right? It might be a good barrier, a border between you and your neighbors.
And I think I've definitely read some research recently regarding the effects of shelter belts and alley cropping, for example, on increases in native pollinators and increases in those native insects, predatory insects that fight pests in agricultural land. So the research is there, it's catching up with different agricultural practices. So I think we'll hear more and more about that in the next coming years.
Yeah, and another one that just come to me too was lodging, right? Like we get that strong wind from the northwest, and that can take down, 10 to 20 acres on one side of the field. So I believe there's a yield boost there as well.
Well, actually, you're absolutely right, Nick, because I was speaking to someone who had some shelter belts, and this was in 2020 when we had good moisture. All his neighbors' peas were lodged. His still were standing because he had the shelter belts in place that broke the wind, and he wasn't scraping them off the ground, and it made the difference with at least 1 grade difference in the peas, and yield was better.
Yep, it also helps with less shelling, right? And less volunteers to deal with next year, and all that stuff adds up.
Keeps
Totally.
canola swaths from blowing across the field.
Yeah.
So kind of talking about these structures on our landscape, and the first thing to consider would be planning for succession. So now that we've kind of discussed the value of these shelter belts, we can talk about planning for succession. So why renovate or maintain them in the first place? And there's really that value there through the different ecological services they provide. And I mean, all the different ecological services that you may be looking for as a landowner, as well as for resiliency in our landscape, and for native species that depend on these structures as well. So we have lots of different types of shelter belts and eco buffers. Some of the most common we can look to the different structures of them based on their function. So roadside shelter belts really are one of those shelter belts that we see quite commonly. Their function was simply to kind of slow down that wind, prevent blowing dust, prevent blowing snow. And as these structures are aging over time, we're looking at why are they aging so poorly and how we can redesign them in particular for a structure that has that resiliency and that retained function over time. And we'll look to design that right in there. Riparian buffers are another great example of different linear buffers along your landscape. So these particular features are planted around waterways or ephemeral streams, ephemeral potholes in the landscape. So they really provide lots of great ecosystem services, particularly stabilizing the banks and improving water quality. Conventional shelter belts, their function reduces over time. So this reduction in function, it's due to a few different things. So largely due to non-native species being used. So those non-native species are not able to propagate themselves as readily as native species are, given that they're not as well adapted to our landscape. Another function another kind of one of those reasons that shelter belts don't do as well over time is they're all that uniform age. So they're planted really all at the same time. So they age uniformly. So all those trees start to get old at the same time. Whereas those more natural forests or natural mimicking forests, they really age all at different times and rejuvenate themselves as they go. That third factor that really limits their succession in a typical shelter belt is lower diversity. So over the years, different environmental hazards will come up. There'll be a drought, there'll be a wind event, there'll be a late frost. So having that increased diversity, and especially of native species, you're really going to buffer your shelter belt over time to some of those factors that may damage it.
Well, I imagine with more diverse species too, you can reduce the impact of disease. If they're not cheek by jowl, you might lose the occasional tree, but you won't lose the whole shooting match.
Yep, absolutely. So you can buffer from a lot of these hazards, environmental hazards that come up through that diversity. So diversity of species, diversity of age, diversity throughout the planting itself. So you really, while horticulturally, you may be looking for something very uniform, that irregular shelter belt is going to see the best succession over the years. Let's see. So looking to longevity as well would be something that you can think about when you're evaluating your shelter belts. So you're going to want to look to ensure that you are including both long-lived and short-lived species, and that all of your species are really adapted to your site conditions. So utilizing some fast-growing species is always nice. You get that quick buffer really quick. But you also want to make sure you're utilizing slower growing species to replace those pioneer species over time and maintain that taller height. So how do you know, how do you know how your shelter belt is aging? So you really want to look to a few different factors when you're looking at your aging shelter belt and determine kind of how it's aging over time and coming up with a plan to take different steps to rejuvenate it or maintain it. So you want to look at the percentage of live trees in your shelter belt. So really, and by live trees, we're looking at the whole tree as alive right up to that top of the canopy. You want to look to how many live trees are next to each other, or do you have patches of dead trees? Do you have different parts of the shelter belt that are having more percentage dead? Something to consider. You want to look to the density of the canopy of the shelter belt as well. So you're really going to notice age in your shelter belt right up there in the canopy first. Due to most trees and that ability to sucker, that bottom part of the shelter belt is going to stay a little thicker, a little greener longer. You want to look to encroachment of disease, insect damage. Those are some of the different things that move in once trees start to become more stressed over time. Keep in mind the life expectancy of your trees and the different species that you've got there, and then look to other factors that may influence your shelter belt as well.
So could you tell me, say for poplar, what's the expected life expectancy of Northwest poplar?
A Northwest poplar. I'd have to look it up to be sure. Though poplars are famously short-lived, fast-growing, and it really is going to depend on your site conditions as well. So a lot of those hybrid species are not a lot longer, 40 years, 30 years, not longer.
What would you consider would be, I guess, for the Flagstaff area, would you consider an apex species and populations?
Well, it depends on the site conditions. So we've got in like uphill, drier sites, you want to look to some pine trees would be your apex species. Depending on the different forest stands like aspen, poplar, balsam poplar, you can look to different white birch, for example. It really depends on where you're at in the county as well, how wet the soil is.
There's not a whole, well, there's some pretty sandy spots just south of Sedgwick.
Yeah. So it'll really vary depending on where you are in the county. If you're like closer to the Battle River, and if you're closer to, let's say, Forsberg or Hardisty, you'll have some different site conditions. Let's see. So in assessing your shelter belt, and take into account its age, relative age, and you want to take into account how it's functioning. So is it a continuous barrier? So is it still providing that function that it was initially designed to provide? What kind of density do you have? Have you lost 50% of your trees? Take a step back and assess how overall your shelter belt is functioning in its role there in the landscape. Look next to overall tree health. So which different species do you have, and how well is that individual species doing? Do you have a long stretch of that one species that's damaged? What would a better candidate be to infill those species that are dying off? Are they dying off because of disease? Is there potentially insect damage contributing to those species dying off? We can look to different tools to diagnose insect damage or pest damage as well. Keep in mind, trees show damage after. So the damage is already well established before the trees are going to show this damage. So you really need to think about taking steps quickly and potentially taking steps to mitigate spread of the diseases or insect damage as well. So while one tree may be showing the damage, other trees around it will also be infected.
What about yellow-bellied sapsuckers? Because they can be devastating on a stand of trees as well, because they'll just bleed them dry.
True. You want to look to assess kind of the overall health of your trees. So whenever I hear of yellow-bellied sapsuckers coming in and it's devastating because they really girdle that tree part way up and they choose those nice looking ones. You want to look at what's contributing. Typically, they're coming after trees that aren't doing so well. So there's other factors at play as well. And I'm not sure, there's not a lot of management tools to recommend to take care of those yellow-bellied sapsuckers. So you want to look to improve the overall health of your tree through that extra babying. So watering them during dry years, you can fertilizer as needed. So different tools to really look after the overall health of the tree. Taking care of any insect problems that might be there as well. Harry, do you have any advice on the yellow-bellied sapsuckers?
Tanglefoot is what I was told.
Tanglefoot.
Yes, so it's a super sticky product that you sort of put on the bark, and because it's so sticky, the birds don't want to get on it. So
Okay.
That was the advice I used to give 30 years ago.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Though I haven't seen it in like a application of a larger or longer shelter belt.
Well,
I've heard of it smaller.
We actually used it on we have a golden willow out front that got a stupid woodpecker was hitting on it. So I put that on there and it stopped them. So it's fairly effective.
Where would you get this stuff at, Harry?
I just get it at a garden center.
Okay.
Comes in a little can. What about spruce budworm?
Spruce budworm, you have to look for signs of spruce budworm and take care of that pretty quickly if you've got it on there, and then look at this different species kind of up and down from where you've seen the original infection and treat those trees as well. So it can definitely be a problem and impact your trees as well. Beadworm can be like really devastating to kind of the appearance of your shelter belt as well. There's different diagnostic tools available. So we always like to recommend this Forest Health Pest Diagnostic System. It's a kind of a free Government of Alberta website. Talks you through how to diagnose your trees and how to shows you different management techniques as well for the different pests. So looking for different signs of spruce budworm and diagnosing that way would be an approach to take. Browse is another factor that you can look for to determine how your trees are doing, how your shelter belt's aging, and potential factors to look into to restoring it. Looking for browse, that's simply animals feeding on your shelter belt. So you want to look for signs of deer, moose, porcupines can be really damaging to shelter belts as well. from some of our agroforestry clients. Porcupines are the worst ones out there for kind of taking out some of those tender fruit trees.
I've seen some pretty bad looking shelterbelts that have been savaged by both deer, moose, as well as porcupines. How do you protect those little things?
People become very I've seen people become very creative in looking to manage their shelter belts or different horticultural species from pests. We've seen anything from using a stucco wire to form a cage around the trees, different flagging to prevent birds from getting to the trees. Porcupines and beavers always recommends using a latex paint mixed with sand on the bark to prevent them from chewing through. There's lots of different techniques out there. It really depends on your capability of kind of implementing that technique. So time, funding, lots of different control measures out there. Diseases are another one to factor in, looking at the different funguses potentially. This great time of year right now to be pruning black knot out of your trees, for example. Always want to make sure you're using a right pruning technique to take out that black knot. So looking to cut 6 inches or more before cleaning your tools. Have to look into this specific type of disease and then follow instructions when you're removing that. Livestock are another factor that not a lot of people think about when they're looking to restore or assess their shelter belt. So livestock, they can really impact that shelter belt. A lot of times shelter belts are designed for livestock, but you really do need to consider livestock use to prevent trampling, rutting over browse on different species of trees. So you'd have to actually manage your livestock when they're using that shelter belt and make sure it's not during kind of critical times of the year where they can cause a lot of damage. So for example, if it's a really, really wet time of year, the cattle in that area can damage the trees a little more easier. That as well, really dry time of the year.
I can say that that's so true, because I used to work on my in-laws' place where we had some trees for shelter where they were calving out. And over the period of about 10 years, they destroyed all those trees through compaction of soil around the roots.
Yeah. There's lots of management techniques out there, but I think the most important for managing livestock in agroforestry or silvopasture is really active management. So you want to just keep aware of the number of livestock you have out there in that area, and then the environmental forested areas. So keep monitoring and then be prepared to move livestock in and out as your tree stand requires, so that you're maintaining that forested area for years to come and not seeing it degrade quickly over a few years. So regulate.
And in the areas where trees are fewer and far between, I've actually seen producers where they'll fence their trees out so the cattle can use them for shelter, be in the shelter of the edges of them, but they're not in with the trees, and it does allow them to survive.
Absolutely. And you don't always have to think about those, permanent fences, investing in permanent fencing. Even some of that temporary or movable electric fencing will be effective in keeping livestock out of forested areas for short time periods, for example, when early spring when it's wet out. So different tools out there to help manage grazing for sure. So tips for restoration and maintenance. Now that we've covered the different shelter belt structures you may have kind of identified them on your property, and we've looked at some of the different tools to assess your shelter belt, we can move into restoring and maintaining your shelter belt. So our first tool really in restoring and maintaining your shelter belt is goal setting and site assessment. So look to the different ecosystem services that you're looking for in your shelter belt. Make a plan with those services in mind. Think about the different site characteristics. your timeline, different long-term and short-term goals of the project. So design your species selection and your maintenance, taking into account all of these different factors. So your resources as well should factor in, your time being a big one. Can you do this maintenance year over year, or do you really only have capacity to do this once? How much funding do you have to contribute? How much space is a good one for your project? Can you take space to plant another row of succession planting along your shelter belt? Or is it something that you need to incorporate into the existing footprint? So designing your shelter belt, look to different species selection for the ecosystem services that you're desiring, and different species that will make use of the land and your different ecosystem characteristics as well. So right off the bat, pruning your shelter belt, don't. So simply put, pruning stresses out your trees. So there's a few reasons, very few reasons to prune your shelter belt. So number one reason to prune would be for safety. So if you have some trees and they're not in good condition and they're going to potentially damage infrastructure on your property, compromise roadways on your property, would be one example of reasons to prune. Another would be disease control, and we mentioned that a couple minutes back talking about black knot, for example. Something to consider instead of pruning would be tree removal. So a lot of the time, folks out there, they like to mention pruning as a way to manage a shelter belt. And if you're looking for your shelter belt for that very long-term landscape level function, consider tree removal instead. So tree removal really offers the opportunity for another tree to grow in place, particularly a tree more suited to your landscape. And then if you really do need to prune safety buildings, you want to look to do that in the time where it's least stressful to the trees. So deciduous pruning, make sure it's during the dormant season, and only prune as absolutely necessary. So pruning in general can create stress in your tree, and that often results in really fast growing softwood suckers. Oftentimes I see shelter belts that are topped, and what grows next are those suckers right from the top of the trees. So the trees, in effect, this stimulates new rapid growing shoots that are structurally weak, causing the tree to become top heavy. General rule, never prune more than 25% of a tree crown, and always use caution pruning. So some things to think about instead of potentially pruning your shelter belts. Tree removal, filling those gaps. There's different techniques to adjust the spacing. We kind of mentioned livestock seclusion. We can add additional rows, understory planting, and then general tree care as well as a maintenance and management tool. So removing trees, after you've assessed your overall stand health, you've looked for insect disease, growing conditions, you want to establish a general management plan for your shelter belt. So take into account your capacity, time always being my restriction there, but time, funding, space. Develop a long-term and short-term management plan, and always keep succession in mind as well. So how is this shelter belt structure going to grow and change over time? So look to removal of selected trees. So do you need to remove that dead material, or do you simply need to move it back into the shelter belt footprint? Do you need to remove live material? Do you have species planted too close together? Do you have species with infestation potentially that you need to take care of? That may include culling or removing living trees as well. And then have a replacement plan, and always think of diversity in your replacement plan. So replace for function. Go back to that management plan that you've initially developed through your assessment and your tree services, and then plant for short and long-term succession with a focus on those services as well. Trees that are planted too close together They're really planted in that fashion to provide a really short-term service. So they're initially capturing that land really quickly. They're growing high to prevent that wind moving through the shelter, adding to their shelter belt function, so making that buffer across the landscape. But a lot of times when trees are planted too close together, and especially, or I mean specifically, those non-native species, they're competing for water, for light, for fertilizer. There's mechanical stress on these trees as the wind is blowing and they're rubbing together. This creates perfect conditions for disease transmission through all of these trees. It slows down their growth. You'll see an increase in suckering, maybe not for the white spruce, but for other species, your Oakneys poplar for sure. You'll see increases in seed production, and eventually you're going to see loss of trees as well. So there's a few adjustments that you can take here. You can relocate some of those trees. Initially, if you plant your shelter belt or your eco buffer dense, you can move those trees. If you're seeing them all surviving and growing too large, you can move them when they're young, space them out along your shelter belts a little bit more. You can also thin them out. So just simply removing them to make room for healthier individual trees is an option. Let's see. So if that wind event does come through and you're left with some gaps in your shelter belt, you want to consider your function again. And is it important to fill in those gaps to maintain the constant barrier? Consider adding diversity when you are. Of course, you'll have diversity based on the age of the tree if you're filling in gaps of a mature shelter belt, but you also want to consider species diversity as well. Plant for different services that maybe aren't provided. You want to, when you're looking to do some replacement planting, you'll want to prepare the site a little bit. Do you need to add a weed control mat or something to take care of the smooth brome ditch grass in this situation? Is weed control going to be an issue? Look to make sure that there's adequate sun, water for your species that you're replanting. And if you're not able to really manage your replant, consider native species. They'll always have the greatest advantage in just being well adapted to that site. Understory planting is another great technique for your shelter belt. So as your aging shelter belt starts to show its years, you can add understory plants right in there. So choosing shade tolerant species that are adapted for that succession in your shelter belt are kind of the ones to pick for this. So looking to that white spruce as a good option.
What other shade tolerant tree species would you suggest, or bush species?
Let's see. So lots of the native trees and shrubs are pretty adaptable. If you look at, let's see, we've got some tools on our website I can show. We have a native tree finder on our Oz website. And so this tool is a great tool for folks to use. It's free on our website. And on here, you can really choose different let me see here, traits of your trees, sun exposure, shade, environmental conditions, and it will pull up tall shrub and do not apply.
So your website's got lots of reference material that we can use.
Absolutely. See, will come up here. So you can choose your site conditions. This is a really important tool to use to choose the individual conditions of your shelter belt and the specific conditions of your area, your soil, your sun exposure, your moisture, and you can pick species that will be really well adapted to your site. So our tool shows specifically native species. That's always kind of our go-to for species to recommend. And for Harry's question here, this high bush cranberry is one to recommend. You can also take a look at shade tolerant species by just taking a walk through forested areas near you, native forested areas, and seeing what's growing in the understory there. Beaked hazelnut is another great example of a shorter shrub. There's plenty. Raspberry, for example, there would be plenty of different species you could choose depending on those ecosystem services that you're looking for. All right, so now that you're thinking about restoring your shelter belts and different species to select and restoring your shelter belts, let's talk about taking your shelter belt to the next level. So thinking about those tree services and what options are out there, what kind of inspiration is there for restoring your shelter belt. So taking your shelter belt to the next level, this can literally mean adding vertical structure for diversity. So you can mix up horizontal and vertical diversity within your shelter belt to create lots of different services. So for example, wildlife habitat is one great service you can find from that vertical structure. So traditional shelter belts have a few problems we've pointed out previously, and the solution essentially to all of those problems is diversity. So we really want to add a diverse mix of species and to overcome a lot of the different kind of factors that take away from our shelter belt production. So by adding diversity through our eco buffer, for example, we can add this resiliency through just the different species conditions and different species survival through different environmental events. So if you're looking specifically as from your traditional shelter belt to your eco buffer, if a pest or disease moves through impacting all of the white trees, for example, you're not left with a lot with your traditional shelter belt, whereas with your eco buffer, you have a lot of options there for trees that are doing well. So how do you upgrade? How do you go from A to B? So firstly, determine your goals for your shelter belt. So look to your local landscape and then add in a diverse selection of those native trees and shrubs and make sure that you maintain room for growth as well. So looking at doing a few phases of shelter belt renovation or eco buffer renovation would be a great opportunity to add some services now, see what does well, and add some services down the road. So the benefit of using all of those native trees and shrubs as well, we've kind of talked about that previously. Native species, they're just so much more resilient. They're so much more adaptable to all of your local conditions. Look to incorporate these native species into your current shelter belt design, and you can increase the resiliency of your current shelter belt. So while you're increasing that resiliency, you can also increase for other services as well. So for example, enhancing with pollinators in mind. So by selecting native flowering species to increase the diversity of your shelter belt, you can increase pollinator habitat. Try to have an arrangement of species with different bloom periods so that together they cover the entire spring to late summer. So that will ensure that active pollinators foraging have access to nectar and pollen throughout those seasons. So in addition to pollinators, you can create habitat for wildlife through that diversity and physical layering. Looking to add herbaceous layers to your shelter belt as well, as those shrub, understory, and canopy layers can help. So adding wildflowers and grasses, native wildflowers and grasses into your shelter belt is one way that you can add diversity as well. You want to choose the best species to add ecosystem services that you're looking for. So for example, for wildlife, you can add different food species, shelter species, reproduction support species, and different other complementary species. So for example, looking to enhance food provisioning for wildlife, there's lots of different choices out there. And lots of times we're thinking of those conventional fruit trees that people use for food provision, but wildlife sometimes use different species as well. So you wouldn't necessarily think of trembling aspen as food for wildlife, but most parts of the tree act as food for birds and mammals as well. Let's see, when you're thinking about wildlife habitat, don't forget winter food and habitat as well. So lots of different species of trees provide winter food for native wildlife, birds, for example. We don't typically think about those snowberries, for example, as palatable food on our landscape, but a lot of our native bird species and cattle, for example, or deer and moose look to those snowberries for winter forage value. Other species as well, including at risk, can be habitat developed for them through our shelter belt, enhancing our shelter belt planting. So one particular species at risk that Oz is looking to develop habitat for would be the loggerhead shrike species. This is a species at risk, native to Flagstaff region. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with loggerhead shrike, but a beautiful songbird and one of the different tree and shrub species that you can incorporate into your shelter belt to promote loggerhead shrike habitat restoration would be anything that has a long, like a barb or a spike on it. So, or a thorn. So these species are looking for those shrubs in particular for habitat restoration. Looking to restore ephemeral drains would be another ecosystem service that we hope to inspire people to renovate their shelter belts to achieve, or even develop new shelter belts. So ephemeral drains are a really essential feature of our landscape. Trees really do a lot for movement of water above ground and below ground. So they act as one of those many management controls for water. The physical structure of trees, for example, helps mitigate or slow down surface water runoff. In agricultural land, they can help soil retain moisture, help the movement of water, particularly during heavy rainfalls. The roots themselves act as micropores, allowing water to infiltrate. As well, those roots hold soil together, preventing erosion. Let's see. And those riparian buffers, really in an agricultural landscape, they help to absorb pollutants and excess nutrients from running over land into riparian areas. So they really protect that waterway from that addition of those chemicals. Another thing to consider, or I guess a recommendation from Oz, would be to look to those ephemeral areas, so those marginal land on your landscape, and potentially that's an opportunity to expand an existing eco buffer or look to extend an eco buffer island nearby. So these structures on our landscape restore opportunity for ephemeral drains to become greater habitat for our wildlife and other species as well. So in addition to all the different specific ecosystem services that our plantings can provide, planting trees, and especially with high biodiversity and using adaptable species, really creates resiliency in our landscape. So this resiliency can, over time, help to mitigate the effects of all of the disturbance agents that move through our landscape. So we're seeing this come into a greater and greater emphasis, simply due to increases in energy in our system. So as we're seeing our planet warming, we're seeing an increase in these disturbance agents, and we're looking to add resiliency to our landscape to buffer these environmental disturbance events. So native species, they really add that buffer, as well as help us recover quicker from disturbances moving through. So the general tool or general rule that we say would be greater disturbance or greater diversity equals greater resiliency to natural disturbances and climate change. And so diversity, you're going to look to your shelter belt again for that longevity and its services. Again, lots of different services shelter belts provide. We can go more into those. We've got a few different presentations. We break out these services into kind of longer presentations, and we can really move into how those trees provide particular ecosystem services. And then if you're looking for assistance developing your shelter belt plan, your renovation plan, our Oz team has definitely the passion there to assist you in developing a particular plan for your property. We really put the pieces together for your successful project. So our team will work to find funding for your project, to find stock, for your project, to design your project for resiliency. We can look to really bring that capacity in any way that you're needing it so that your planting project can be successful. And we work with partners like Brook and Flagstaff County to bring together projects for participants as well. So in conclusion, take a look at your shelter belt, assess how your shelter belt condition is doing, how is it serving its ecosystem services, look to identify any problems, and of course, make a plan for succession. So we have some time for questions and discussion.
Yeah, that was very interesting stuff, Megan. You are a wealth of knowledge. So I do have one question here.
Okay.
And it comes to basically site preparation. So I'll throw a scenario at you. Let's say we have a 3-row shelter belt and it's about 30 years old and our poplars are starting to die, right? So given me and a chainsaw, I go out there and I fall them all. And then like ideally you would go in there and stump grind. Is that correct? Would be the next step?
Well, it depends. I guess the first step would be, and you've done your assessment, your poplars, they've aged out, and
Yep.
you've fallen them down, you've removed that safety hazard.
Right.
What services are you looking for from your shelter belt? Are you looking to provide that buffer for wind?
Yes.
Were you looking for privacy? What was that shelter belt's purpose?
Privacy and wind. Let's go with privacy and wind. Yeah.
So look to the different site conditions. I guess if your poplar were healthy and strong, and looking at the different trees that are thriving in that area now, do you have other species in this shelter belt that are doing really well? Is there any or established grass that we need to be wary of?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of my question there is like what is the ultimate bed for replanting seedlings? Is it to have bare soil? Is it good to have roots already there from the previous poplar trees, or like native grasses as well, right? Like I know like sunlight is obviously a very key element to establishing seedlings, so, and as well as warm soils too. So maybe like is mulching a very good approach to that as well? What's your take on bed preparation?
My take on bed preparation is first look at what you have to work with. So compaction would be one, compaction or invasive weeds, smooth brome, any deficiencies in nutrients in the soil. So you want to look at what your bed looks like initially. So if you're looking at an aged out shelter belt, depending on the different composition of species, if you have Carigana as part of that shelter belt, they're going to be a tough competitor, taking over that area fairly quickly, but they're also going to be fixing nitrogen, so improving the soil as they go. So do you have land next to your shelter belt where you could plant another couple rows, eco buffer style, for example, to improve the planting? That would be my first recommendation, would be to seek the area next to your shelter belt, perhaps near the Carigana, and plant a couple rows of an eco buffer using native species, and then adding in species that will provide those ecosystem services that you need to rejuvenate your shelter belt. So you don't necessarily need to stump grind your poplar or mulch them for that matter. There's lots of habitat resources there for wildlife, for example, in those, like that matter being left in the shelter belt area. If it is something that you'd like to do to remove them, you certainly can grind the stumps out or drag the material elsewhere, use it as firewood, for example, or mulch.
Okay, would you say that's the best approach if if extending the shelter belt further into the field or the ditch is not necessarily the way to do it?
Not necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily grind the stumps out unless there's a reason you need to remove that material. Potentially, that poplar in the base of that shelter belt there will provide habitat or cover, shelter for your seedlings as they're establishing, so that they're protected from wind moving through, pests moving through, any kind of wildlife browsing. They may see more protection from that material in the shelter belt. That said, too much is definitely going to be hard. So, your trees aren't going to grow if they're in the middle of a wood pile.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that answers my question. Thank you. I have one more on. I know this definitely depends on what species we're talking about or dealing with here, but what's kind of good spacing recommendations for, let's start with shrubs and then we'll work our way up.
So it depends on the type of shrubs. Looking specifically, we like to plant those native species. So we plant our eco buffers, and depending on our size and our budget, we're planting them about 1 meter apart for our trees and shrubs. So we're planting our shrubs in between our trees. I have a slide here for eco buffer plantings. Here, about 1 meter by 2 meter spacing. And if you look at this diagram here, we have your low shrubs planted near the outside of your eco buffer, and your taller nurse trees and your long-lived trees in the center, mainly in the center. So because those shrubs and native species we're not planting them for that horticultural value, for that perfect round shape of your lilac. We're planting them for that ecosystem function. So if they're planted a bit closer together, they'll also be suckering and working to create that natural forest look. If you're looking to plant non-native species, so lilacs or other non-natives, you'll certainly find information on recommendations to follow for planting distances. And a lot of the growers will have those recommendations readily available for you. So different cultivars will have different spacing requirements. So always check with the grower.
Right. Yeah. One thing I like about this eco buffer design, it's much more diverse and integrated compared to our traditional methods of planting shelter belts, right? Rather than having identified rows of each species, right? We're kind of inco-meaning everything together here, which is I do like that approach.
Yeah, and I guess I always remember my childhood on the farm. Saturday afternoons spent mowing around the shelter belt or rototilling. So you'll notice this eco buffer design here. You're not going to be able to fit that mower or that rototiller in between the trees. It's not meant for that management, active management. It's meant to really manage itself through like that dense.
Right. More forest-like.
Yep. If you have that traditional shelter belt, your spacing is going to be determined somewhat by the need to move equipment through to maintain that shelter belt design. So consider the width of your mower, for example, and then add a little extra, because we do see significant tree loss when we have the mowers moving through, especially for operators who are in a hurry. Saturday afternoons.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely can relate to what you go through there.
Yeah, I think most farm kids can.
Yeah. All right, that's about all the questions I have. Other than that, you basically answered them within your great presentation. Harry, would you like to add anything here?
No, I think it was pretty well covered. Thank you, Megan.
We'll have to talk about a county tour we can drive through and look at some great shelter belts in the summer. I have some good ones to point out for folks who are interested in learning about shelter belt succession and restoration.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I have one last thing to add here. This is just a reminder to our ratepayers that Flagstaff County has an ongoing Shelterbelt establishment program that runs from late fall until January 31st the following year. So unfortunately, it's too late to get on board this year, but going forward, it's a great way to get trees in the ground in a cost-effectively manner. We have a cost share program within the county, so basically the county will cover half the cost of the trees if you're wanting to set up or restore a shelter belt. So if this is something that interests you, you can find some details on our website, and most certainly get in touch with Harry or myself. So, and that wraps up our evening. So I'd like to thank Megan again for giving us her time today, as well as the Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society. This was a wonderful presentation. I could take away a lot from this one. So thank you again, Megan.
Yes, thank you.